When he first bought the land, he imagined it would stay peaceful for years. It sat on the edge of a quiet town, surrounded by tall trees and long stretches of open grass that made it easy to forget how loud the rest of the world could be. People passed by it all the time without paying much attention, and that was exactly how he liked it. He loved the calm moments, the sound of birds, and the feeling of space that wasn't crowded by houses, rules, or committees. Life stayed simple for a long time. He would drive out there on weekends to walk around, check the fence lines, and make sure everything looked the same as he remembered. Most days, it did. The land didn't change quickly, and that was part of its charm. But one morning, when he turned down the dirt road that led to his property, he noticed something different before he even reached the gate. There were fresh tire tracks in the soil wide, heavy ones that didn't belong to any vehicle he owned. At first, he didn't think too much of it. Maybe someone turned around on the road, or maybe a delivery truck took a wrong turn. It happened sometimes. But as he drove deeper into the property, the signs became harder to ignore. A pile of lumber stood near the tree line, neatly stacked like someone had left it there on purpose. A little farther in, he spotted bags of cement resting under a plastic sheet, as if waiting for workers to come back and finish a job. He stepped out of his truck and walked around slowly, trying to understand what he was looking at. This wasn't random. This was preparation. He felt a quiet tension in his chest, like the mind trying to catch up to something the eyes already understood. Someone had started a project on his land. Not near it. Not beside it. Right on it. He checked the boundaries mentally. He knew the lines by heart. His grandfather had shown him when he was younger, walking him across every corner so he'd never forget. There was no chance he was mistaken. This wasn't shared property. It wasn't public land. It was his. He crouched beside a wooden stake hammered into the ground. Bright orange tape fluttered at the top, marking it as part of a planned layout. He pulled out one of the bags of cement a little to see the label. New. Recently purchased. Someone was preparing to build something here, and whoever it was felt confident enough to bring in supplies without asking a single question. He returned to his truck, took a slow breath, and drove toward the back of the property to be sure this wasn't some misunderstanding. But the deeper he went, the more signs he found. Wooden stakes, spray-painted lines on the dirt, even a temporary workbench made from 2 planks and cinder blocks. Then he saw the small group of people. 3 workers stood near the edge of the trees, unloading metal posts from a flatbed trailer. They didn't react when he drove up, at least not at first. They continued working as if this was the most normal thing in the world. When he stepped out of his truck again, one of the workers finally looked over. "You guys lost?" he asked, keeping his tone steady, not wanting to sound angry or confrontational. One of them shook his head. "We're with the neighborhood project," the man said, wiping his hands on his jeans. "We're putting up a park extension. HOA approved it." He waited for the man to say more, maybe something like sorry. Wrong lot, but instead the worker pointed around casually. "That line there marks the start of the walking path," the man added. "We'll have the posts in by this afternoon." He stood still for a moment, trying to process what he had just heard. "This is my land," he finally said. "Nobody approved anything with me?" The worker shrugged, not angry, just uninterested in the dispute. "You should talk to the HOA. They told us this area was included in the project. We just work based on the paperwork." It was strange how quickly the world could shift. Yesterday he had a quiet property that nobody bothered. Today strangers were treating it like a community park, walking freely across it with tools and materials as if they owned the place. He didn't blame the workers. They were just doing their job, but he couldn't let this continue. He asked them politely to stop until things were sorted out. They didn't argue, but they also didn't look confident enough to halt anything on their own. One of them made a call, speaking quietly to someone he assumed was a supervisor. When he hung up, he told him the same thing again. "You need to talk to the HOA board. They're handling everything." He left the property with the same slow tension in his chest, the kind that didn't rise sharply, but grew heavier the longer he held it. He didn't want to jump to conclusions, but the situation didn't feel like a simple misunderstanding. It felt coordinated, planned, and the lack of communication made it worse. He drove straight to the HOA office, which sat at the entrance of the neighborhood next door. The building was small, more like a repurposed house, but they treated it like a fortress of rules and regulations. Inside, a few people were sitting behind the counter, typing away or sorting papers. "I need to speak with whoever approved a construction project on my land," he said calmly. The room went quiet for a second. The woman behind the desk looked up with a practiced smile that faded only a little when she realized he wasn't joking. "Your land?" she asked. He explained what he had seen: the lumber, the cement, the workers, the layout markings. She nodded slowly, then motioned toward a door on the side. "You'll need to speak with the board president," she said. He followed her gesture and knocked on the door. Inside, the president sat behind a desk covered with documents. The man greeted him politely at first, but when he started explaining the situation, the president's expression changed. "We already approved the park extension months ago," the president said. "We're expanding the walking trail and adding seating areas. It's part of the community plan," kept his voice steady. "You're building it on my private property." The president leaned back, folding his arms. "According to our maps, that section falls within our boundary." He shook his head. "Those maps are wrong." The president sighed in a way that sounded more annoyed than concerned. "This project has already been funded. If you're saying the boundary is incorrect, you'll need to provide proof. Until then, construction will continue. We can't halt progress based on claims alone." It was a strange moment. Not explosive, not loud, just cold. The kind where someone pretends to be polite, but doesn't hide the belief that they're in the right. "And you're an obstacle. I don't want any conflict," he said. "I just want the building to stop until the landlines are verified." The president shook his head again. "We've already verified everything we need to verify. If you have concerns, file a complaint. But the project won't pause over a misunderstanding." A misunderstanding. That word stayed with him as he walked out of the office. It wasn't the kind of misunderstanding people corrected. It was the kind people used when they wanted to avoid responsibility. When he got home, sat at his table, going through the old papers his grandfather had handed down to him. Land deeds, surveys, old maps, even hand-drawn notes, marking where the boundaries met natural landmarks. The lines were clear. His land was his land. No amount of wishful thinking could shift those markers inward to give the HOA more space. Still, he didn't want to make assumptions. He called a licensed surveyor and booked the earliest appointment. If there was going to be a dispute, it needed to be based on facts, not assumptions or boardroom confidence. The next morning, before the surveyor arrived, he returned to the property. The workers were already there again, moving materials and preparing the posts. They greeted him politely, but continued working as if nothing had changed from yesterday. He didn't argue with them. They weren't the problem. He walked slowly through the area, feeling the weight of seeing strangers taking over something that had been in his family for years. It wasn't anger he felt. It was more like disbelief, mixed with a quiet determination he hadn't realized he had. He stood near the edge of the clearing, looking at the orange tape fluttering in the wind. It was meant to mark future benches, walkways, and community spaces, but none of it belonged here. None of it had been discussed with him. None of it had been approved. The land didn't feel peaceful that morning. It felt taken. When the surveyor's truck came down the road, he felt a small sense of relief. At least someone would help him establish the truth. They walked the property together, using tools more precise than any map the HOA claimed to have. The surveyor measured every corner, every angle, every line. By the end of the visit, the surveyor didn't look uncertain at all. "I'll finalize everything in the report," he said. "But I can already tell you this. They're definitely building on your land." It wasn't a surprise. The moment he saw the lumber that first day, he felt something was off. But hearing someone else confirm it made everything sharper. Real, unavoidable. He thanked the surveyor and sent copies of the upcoming report request to the HOA office, asking again for construction to stop until the boundaries were clarified. He didn't hear anything back that day. Not a call, not an email, not even a quick message acknowledging his concern. Silence could be many things. Sometimes it meant people were busy. Sometimes it meant they didn't know what to say. But in this case, silence felt like a strategy. That night, he sat outside under the fading light, thinking through everything that had happened. He wasn't someone who liked conflict. He didn't go looking for trouble. But he also couldn't let something as important as his land be ignored or taken over without even a conversation. This wasn't just a pile of lumber or a few stakes in the ground. It was the start of something much bigger, and if he didn't stand firm now, the next time he visited the property, he might find benches installed, a trail carved into the soil, or even a sign that said Community Park Welcome. He wasn't going to let that happen. Part 1 ends with him preparing himself mentally for whatever comes next. Not angry, not fearful, just steady. Ready to protect what is his, even if the road ahead won't be simple. He woke up early the next morning with a feeling that he hadn't felt in a very long time, a mix of frustration, worry, and a strange sense of responsibility. He wasn't sure how the situation had grown so serious so quickly, but now that it had, he knew he couldn't ignore it. The surveyor's words still echoed in his mind, clear and firm. They're definitely building on your land. There was no guessing, no confusion, no halfway answers. It was his land, and someone else was claiming part of it as their own. He didn't like waking up with a heavy mind. So he tried to start the morning slowly. He made coffee, stood by the window, and watched the steam rise as the early sun pushed through the trees. But even with the calm morning light, he couldn't shake the feeling that things were shifting, the kind of shift that didn't come from nature or time, but from people deciding things without asking permission. He finished his coffee and gathered copies of the old documents again. He wanted to make sure there was nothing he missed. He rolled out the maps across the table, smoothing the edges, tracing his fingers along the boundary lines. They were exactly the same as the ones the surveyor used the day before. Everything matched. Nothing was unclear. He placed the papers back into the folder, locked it in the drawer beside his desk, and grabbed his keys. He didn't want to go to the HOA office again that morning, but he knew he needed to keep trying. If he didn't push the issue, they would move forward exactly as they planned. And he already saw what moving forward looked like: posts, cement, spray-painted lines, and a project that treated his land like it belonged to someone else. When he arrived at his property, the workers were already there. This time, though, they seemed to be doing more than unloading materials. 2 of them were measuring long distances with a tape line stretched between stakes. Another was marking the ground in chalk. He didn't like interrupting people doing their job, but he walked toward them slowly, hands in his pockets. "Morning," he said. Keeping his tone steady, they all looked up, some nodding politely. One of the workers walked over. "We're supposed to get the posts in today," he said. "They want us to move fast because a big shipment of materials is coming tomorrow." He kept his voice calm. "I'm asking again, please don't put anything in the ground until this is sorted out. I'm waiting for the survey report, and I've asked your HOA to pause the work." The worker shifted awkwardly. "We've been told to keep going. They said this area belongs to the community. If you want us to stop, you'll need the board to call it in." He nodded slowly. The workers weren't the ones causing the problem. They were just caught in the middle, and it showed on their faces. "I understand," he said quietly. "Thank you for at least listening." He walked back to his truck with a heaviness in his chest. It wasn't anger that weighed on him, it was the feeling of being dismissed, brushed aside for something he never agreed to before leaving the property. He walked along the tree line, moving slowly, taking in everything around him. The trees he grew up seeing now felt like silent witnesses to something that shouldn't have been happening. The ground showed marks where vehicles had driven in and out, and some of the soil was disturbed as if workers had tested where to pour the cement. He crouched down near one of the stakes, pulling the tape gently. The workers had put them in straight lines, connecting one point to the next, forming a shape he didn't like seeing. It was the outline of a walking path, a path that cut through the middle of his land like it belonged to someone else. He stood up and sighed, brushing off the dirt from his hands. There was no point staying there longer. He had to keep working on the next steps, and the next step meant dealing with the HOA again. When he arrived at their office, the woman behind the desk looked up. "A little surprised to see him again?" "I sent a boundary report request yesterday," he said. "Has anyone reviewed it?" She clicked through her computer, then frowned slightly. "It looks like the board received your email, but they haven't responded yet." He exhaled slowly. "Is the president available?" She hesitated, then nodded toward the office door. "You can try, but he's in a meeting." He knocked anyway. The president looked up from his desk when he entered. There were two other board members sitting inside, talking quietly over papers. "I really need to discuss the construction happening on my land," he said. "I'm asking you again, please pause the project until the survey report comes in. It should be ready within a few days." The president leaned back with a calm expression, as if he had heard this same thing from dozens of people before. "We respect your concern," he said, "but we have already confirmed the boundaries on our end. The project is underway, and delaying it could cost the community money." He felt that familiar tightness in his chest again. "It's going to cost me much more if you continue building on something that belongs to me." The president clasped his hands together. "If you're so certain about your claim, you can file an objection. We have a process for that. I've already sent documentation," as the president said, "and the board will review it when the time comes. But until then, the project continues." The meeting was polite, but every word felt like a brick wall. No matter how calmly he explained things, it came back to the same point the HOA had decided, and they weren't interested in changing course. When he left the office, the sky had turned cloudy, the kind of soft gray that made the world feel heavier. He sat in his truck for a moment, wondering why something so simple, ownership, had turned into such a complicated mess. Driving back home, he thought about his grandfather, who used to say that land was more than soil. It was memory, effort, responsibility. It was something people cared about because they put parts of their lives into it. He didn't think the HOA understood that. To them, land was a shape on a map, something that could be shifted or expanded. If someone approved it on paper, he spent the afternoon gathering every document he had. He scanned the old deeds, printed out the survey request confirmation, gathered the historic photos, and even pulled out a framed picture of him standing beside his grandfather near one of the corner markers. It wasn't a legal document, but it reminded him why this mattered. By the time he finished, the sun was already low. He decided to take one more trip to the land before calling it a day. Something in him felt drawn back there. Maybe because he didn't like the idea of strangers working on it without him seeing what they were doing. When he arrived this time, the workers were gone. The site was quiet, but not untouched. New stakes were in the ground. More chalk lines had been drawn. Someone had driven a small machine over the soil, flattening an area that wasn't flattened before. He stood there for a long moment, trying to steady himself. Nothing terrible had happened, but everything felt wrong. Every mark on the ground felt like a reminder that someone else thought they had more right to this space than he did. He walked the perimeter again, moving slowly, making sure everything was still the same. When he reached the far corner, he noticed something new: an HOA sign leaning against a tree, still wrapped in plastic. It wasn't installed yet, but the letters could be seen through the wrapping. Future Walking Trail Extension. It didn't touch the sign. He just stared at it quietly. That was the moment he felt the shift inside himself. A line had been crossed. Not a boundary line on paper, but something deeper. This wasn't just a misunderstanding or a clerical error. It was a decision someone made thinking he wouldn't push back, thinking he would either give in or be too overwhelmed to fight it. He wasn't a loud person. He wasn't dramatic. He didn't start arguments. But he also wasn't the kind of person who let things slide when they were clearly wrong. In that moment, he realized something important. He didn't need to fight with anger. He didn't need to shout or threaten or match the HOA's stubbornness with more stubbornness. He just needed to stay steady, patient, and focused. The truth was on his side. The surveyor was on his side. The documents were on his side. Everything he needed was already there. It just needed to be put together properly. He spent the next day preparing. He organized every document into a neat folder. He contacted a property rights advisor for guidance. He even took photos of every stake, every chalk line, every piece of machinery track left in the soil. He didn't know exactly how long the process would take, but he knew that every step mattered. That night, for the first time since the whole situation began, he felt a quiet sense of confidence. Not because the problem was solved, far from it, but because he finally felt like he had a direction to move in. He wasn't stuck anymore. He wasn't just reacting to what others were doing. He had a plan forming in his mind, built slowly. Like something that would take shape piece by piece. The next days would test his patience. And the next steps would take more than simple conversations. But he wasn't backing down. It's not now. Not when the land meant more to him than anyone else could understand. Part 2 ends with him preparing himself for what comes after: letters, meetings, paperwork, and maybe difficult conversations. But he's steadier now, more grounded, ready to face whatever comes next. The next morning began with a quiet heaviness in the air, kind that makes a person feel like something big is about to unfold. He woke up earlier than usual, almost as if his body already knew the day wouldn't be normal. The sun had barely risen, and the house still felt cool from the night. He made a simple breakfast, but half of it stayed on the plate because his mind refused to settle. Every few minutes, he caught himself staring out the window, toward the tree line where his land stretched beyond what most people could see. He knew that somewhere out there, the half-built structure the HOA had started still stood, almost like a challenge waiting for his response. He had already taken the first steps with the surveyors and the county office. But now came the part where he had to deal with the people who had caused the mess in the first place. He wasn't a man who liked confrontation. He liked quiet days, steady work, and the kind of life where problems could be solved with calm words. But the past few days felt like he had been backed into a corner without even realizing it. And now he needed to step out of that corner with a clear head. He packed a copy of the survey results, the photographs he had taken of the construction, and the letter he had received from the county office confirming that the structure was unauthorized. He placed everything in a simple folder. No fancy binder or thick file, just a folder that showed he wasn't trying to intimidate anyone. He was only trying to stand on the truth. Before he left the house, he paused at the door for a moment. He looked back at his living room, the small table by the window, the shelf he had built himself years ago. He had always taken pride in doing things the right way, the honest way. And somehow, it made the whole situation even more frustrating. People who barely knew him had acted like they could just take a piece of his life and build on it without asking. That feeling, the idea of losing something he had worked for, stayed with him as he stepped outside. When he reached the HOA office, the parking lot was already half full. It was a simple building with white paint and a small sign by the entrance. Most people walked in and out of it without thinking twice, but today it felt like walking into a room that held a story he didn't ask to be part of. Inside, a few residents were waiting near the reception desk. Some nodded politely, some looked curious, and one or two seemed uncomfortable, as if they already knew why he was there. The receptionist greeted him with a practiced smile, the same kind people use when they have to follow rules someone else set. When he explained that he needed to speak with the board, she hesitated, but only for a moment, then made a quick call. A few minutes later, he was ushered into a conference room with a long table, bright lights, and the faint smell of coffee from an earlier meeting. 3 board members sat on the far side of the table. They weren't unfriendly, but they carried an air of authority they seemed to enjoy. They introduced themselves politely, though the politeness felt thin, almost like it was being stretched to cover something underneath. Once everyone was seated, he placed the folder on the table and pushed it slightly forward. "I came to talk about the structure your team started on my land," he said calmly. "I think there's been a mistake." The board members exchanged looks before the one in the center leaned forward. "What makes you say it's your land?" the man asked, though his voice didn't carry genuine curiosity, more like annoyance. He opened the folder and handed them the survey results and photos. The room stayed quiet for a long minute as they examined the documents. The board members whispered to one another, their faces slowly changing from confident to unsettled. Finally, the woman on the left cleared her throat. "We were told this area was open land connected to the subdivision," she said. "It was communicated to us as part of an expansion plan." "And who told you that?" he asked gently. She hesitated. A developer we worked with last year, he nodded, even though inside he felt a wave of disbelief. A single misunderstanding shouldn't have led to workers showing up with equipment on his property, building something without asking the owner. But here he was. I don't want trouble, he said slowly. I just need the structure removed and the land restored. That's all I'm asking. The man in the center frowned. That may take time. Our budget is already set for the year, and we'll have to consult with our committee. He stayed quiet for a moment to keep his frustration from showing on his face. He wasn't trying to rush them or demand anything unreasonable, but he also couldn't accept a vague answer that could stretch on for months. I already contacted the county, he said softly. They reviewed the situation and said the structure is illegal. They also said it needs to be addressed immediately. I can handle the removal myself if needed, but I need a clear agreement from you that you understand the mistake and won't interfere. This time, the board members looked more concerned. The mention of the county office had clearly moved the discussion from simple annoyance to responsibility. They asked him to wait outside so they could talk privately. He stepped into the hallway, leaning against the wall as a few residents walked by. One older man stopped and spoke quietly. I heard something happen with your land, the man said. If it's true they've built on it, you're handling this better than most people would. He thanked him with a small nod. That short exchange helped him breathe easier. Not everyone in the community approved of what the HOA had done, and that meant something. After 10 minutes, the door opened and he was called back inside. This time, the atmosphere in the room felt different. Less confident. More cautious. We've reviewed the documents, the woman said, and it appears there truly was an error. We're willing to sign an agreement acknowledging the mistake, and we'll remove the structure at our cost. The words should have felt like a victory, but the way they were delivered sounded stiff, like they were doing it because they had no other choice. Still, he accepted the agreement because he believed in resolving things peacefully when possible. They shook hands, though the handshake felt cold. He left the building feeling lighter, but not entirely relieved. Something about the interaction stayed with him the way they had hesitated. The vague tone behind their responses, the quickness with which they shifted blame to someone else. It wasn't distrust exactly. Just awareness. Later in the afternoon, he walked back to the area where the half-built structure still stood. The sun was shining through the trees, casting long shadows across the clearing. The materials were scattered around, some already weathered from the days they had been left there. He stood quietly, imagining how the place would look once it was restored. He didn't want anything fancy, just his land back the way it had always been. Peaceful, untouched, clean. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that even if the HOA removed the structure, the situation wasn't fully over. He had discovered that people who didn't own the land had felt confident enough to build on it without checking, without asking, without caring. That kind of carelessness didn't disappear overnight. A week passed, and still nothing changed. No crew came. No equipment arrived. No message from the board appeared in his inbox. The structure remained exactly where it stood, like a symbol of empty promises. At first, he waited patiently. Patience came naturally to him. But after the second week, he felt something shift inside. Not anger, just certainty. If he wanted the land restored, he would have to take action himself, just as the county office had said he could. So he made a plan. A careful, calm plan. A plan that wouldn't break any rules, wouldn't harm anyone, and wouldn't create conflict, but would show the HOA that ignoring him was not the same as solving the problem. He walked around the structure again, this time with more intention. He took notes, measured areas, checked where the ground had been disturbed. He was preparing for the next step, the one that would begin with his own hands and his own equipment. A sense of focus returned to him. It felt good. It felt like taking back control after weeks of uncertainty. He didn't know exactly how the HOA would respond when they realized he was moving forward, but he knew he wasn't doing anything wrong. He was simply restoring what belonged to him, something no one should have taken in the first place. The next morning came with a kind of quiet that didn't feel peaceful at all. It felt like the calm that settles in right before something big happens. He barely slept through the night, not because he was scared, but because his mind kept circling the same thought over and over. He had proof now, and the HOA was out of excuses. He drove to his land early again before the sun had fully climbed up. The sky was pale, a little gray, hinting that there might be rain later. He hoped it wouldn't delay anything because he needed this day to move forward. When he reached the road to his property, he slowed the truck and looked carefully ahead. The workers were back, but something was different this time. They weren't setting up posts or clearing brush like before. Instead, most of them were gathered near the stacks of lumber, talking in short, stiff voices. A cluster of pickup trucks and 2 small utility trailers were parked nearby. At first he wondered if they were waiting for instructions, but as soon as he stepped out of his truck, realized they had already gotten them. A man wearing a reflective vest walked toward him. He looked like a supervisor, maybe the main contractor for the project. He wasn't rude, but he also wasn't relaxed. His jaw was set tight, and he held a clipboard like it was a shield. "You're the property owner?" the supervisor asked. He nodded. "Yes, and I sent notice to the HOA yesterday with the updated survey. Construction should be paused." The supervisor sighed through his nose. The kind of sigh people give when they're stuck in the middle of something they don't want to deal with. "Look," the supervisor said, "I got orders to stop until the HOA verifies the new documents. We're not supposed to remove anything, but we're not moving ahead either. It wasn't exactly a victory, but it wasn't a loss either." It was something like a temporary truce. He thanked the workers for stepping back. They didn't seem upset. In fact, most looked relieved, probably tired of being caught between 2 sides. He walked across the land once more, checking everything, making sure nobody had pushed deeper onto the property. The orange stakes were still there, the cement bags still stacked. Tools lay around like someone hit pause in the middle of a job. He didn't want to stare at the mess forever. Instead, he left again, heading straight toward town because he knew the next step was waiting at the HOA office. Today, he wasn't going to let them brush him aside with polite smiles or clipped phrases. He had the survey in his hands, printed in 3 copies, highlighted, stamped, and signed. He even brought the old deed with him just in case. If they wanted proof, he was ready to hand them more than enough when he walked into the HOA office. The same woman sat behind the counter. She greeted him with a stiff, cautious expression like she already knew why he was there. "The board president is in a meeting," she said. He didn't raise his voice. "Then please let him know I'm waiting." The woman nodded, disappeared into the back office, and didn't return for a long time. Maybe 10 minutes, maybe 15. He wasn't sure, because time always dragged differently when you were dealing with people trying to avoid you. Finally, the door opened and the board president stepped out. He gave a small, controlled smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I got your email," the president said. "Let's discuss it in my office." He followed the man inside. Once the door closed, the president sat down like he was preparing for a storm he didn't want. "You're bringing forward a new survey?" the president said, glancing at the papers. "But the documents we used were from the county records." He set the survey on the desk. "Your documents were outdated. This is the corrected survey from a licensed professional. It includes the GPS markers, the updated coordinates, and the property lines confirmed by current measurements. You're building on my land." The president tapped the papers lightly, as if hoping the truth might change if he touched the page enough times. "We already invested a significant amount into this project," the president finally said. "Equipment, materials, labor, all of it was approved. Moving the boundary now will affect our entire plan." "It's not moving a boundary," he said calmly. "It's respecting the right one." The president leaned back. "We'll have to bring this to the full board. There's a process we must follow." "How long will that take?" he asked. The president shrugged in a way that made the answer seem dishonest even before he spoke. "A few weeks, maybe longer." "Weeks, maybe longer." That wasn't an answer anyone gave when they genuinely wanted to help. He breathed slowly through his nose to stay composed. "You're trespassing. I'm giving you the chance to stop willingly. If you keep delaying, you're forcing me to take legal action." The president stiffened. "Let's not escalate things." "I'm not escalating anything," he said. I'm protecting my land. You're the one who pushed a construction crew onto private property. The president's face changed slightly, not guilt, not anger, but something like the realization that the situation was no longer easy to dismiss. I'll call an emergency meeting, the president said finally. Give the board until tomorrow. He nodded once. Tomorrow is fine. He walked out of the office, feeling the weight of the conversation still sitting on his shoulders. But at least it was movement. Slow movement, but movement. A step forward. That afternoon, while he waited for the meeting, he took a long walk around the land again. This time trying to imagine how long the HOA had been planning their project. How many months they had looked at those faulty maps. How many conversations they must have had without ever thinking to include him. Every time he looked at the construction materials, he was reminded that someone had made a decision to treat his land as if it were another open canvas for their community improvements. He didn't hate community improvements. He liked parks, walking trails, benches, open spaces. But he didn't like them being built without permission, especially not on the land his family had held for generations. That evening, he received a short email from the HOA confirming the emergency meeting schedule for the next day at noon. No apologies, no explanations, just the meeting notice. Still, it was better than silence. He tried to relax that night, but the closer the meeting came, the more unsettled he felt. Not nervous, just aware of how unpredictable people could be when they realized they were in the wrong but didn't want to admit it. When the next day arrived, he showed up at the HOA building early. He wasn't going to give them any reason to claim he missed something. Inside the boardroom, a group of people sat around a long table. Some looked uncomfortable. Some looked defensive. Others looked like they had already made up their minds before the meeting even started. The board president opened the session with a firm voice. We've gathered today to address the dispute over the land adjacent to the community boundary. The property owner has provided a new survey. We will review it. He handed out the copies. The room filled with the sound of papers rustling. He watched their faces carefully, trying to read each expression. Some eyebrows raised. Some lips pressed tightly. A couple of the board members exchanged quick glances. One finally spoke. This is significantly different from the map we were using. It's the correct one, he said calmly. Another board member leaned forward. Where did you get this survey? I hired a licensed professional yesterday. He measured everything with updated equipment. It confirms my original deed. The boardroom fell into a quiet tension. The wife of one board member whispered something to him, and the man looked down at the table. Eventually, one of the older members cleared her throat. We should have reached out before approving the project. That part is clear. The president shifted in his seat. We didn't know there was a boundary question. He kept his tone steady. You never asked? A long silence followed. Finally, another member spoke. We need to stop the project. There's no other choice. The president looked unhappy, but after a moment he nodded reluctantly. We'll vote. The vote wasn't close. Only one person voted to continue the project. Everyone else voted to halt it and remove the materials from his property. It was the first real moment where he felt a bit of relief. Not excitement, not celebration, just relief. But the meeting wasn't finished yet. A different board member spoke up, flipping through the survey again. This changes more than the park extension. We plan future development here. We use the same boundary lines for all our planning. The president tapped a pen on the desk. We may need to revisit the entire expansion plan. If our maps were wrong once, they may be wrong in other areas too. The room filled with quiet murmurs. It was clear the mistake was bigger than a small trail being misplaced. Their whole blueprint for future additions rested on faulty assumptions. He didn't take any pleasure in seeing them scramble. But he also didn't feel the need to soften anything. Mistakes had consequences, and these consequences came from their own lack of communication. When the meeting ended, the board president approached him aside from the others. We'll clear your land by the end of the week, the president said, and we'll review our planning documents. He nodded. Thank you. The president hesitated, then added, this might become a costly correction for us. Didn't have to be, he replied quietly. He walked out of the building knowing the conflict wasn't fully over yet. The land would be cleared, but the damage had already been done. Not physical damage, something else. Something deeper. The trust between him and the HOA had been shaken, maybe broken. And it was hard to imagine what it would take to rebuild it. As he drove back toward the property, he thought about how strange the past few days had been. He wasn't a loud person. He didn't storm into offices or cause scenes. But protecting your land meant standing firm, even when people tried to make you feel unreasonable for doing so. When he reached the property again, the workers were already packing up equipment. They looked at him with polite nods. Some seemed relieved. One even said quietly, "Honestly, man, I'm glad this got sorted out. We didn't want to be in the middle of it." He thanked them again and watched as the trailers moved slowly down the road, one by one, leaving the land a little quieter each time. The lumber still needed to be hauled away. The stakes still needed to be pulled out. The cement bags still needed to be returned or stored. But all of that would happen soon. The important part, the part that had been hanging over his head for days, was settled, or at least he thought it was. He didn't know yet that the board president wasn't finished trying to shift responsibility. He didn't know the HOA was already discussing what the mistake would cost them, or how to justify those costs to the neighborhood. He didn't know that the story wasn't going to end with a quiet removal of materials. Part 4 ended with a strange balance relief on one side, unease on the other. Because he had won the first battle, yes. But he could feel it in his bones. The real fight was just beginning. For the next few days, he watched the land slowly return to its quiet self. The workers came and took away the last stacks of lumber. The cement bags were hauled off. The trailers left one after another, leaving behind only the faint marks of tire tracks on the soft dirt. The stakes with orange tape were pulled out of the ground, one by one, until the land looked more or less like it had before the whole mess started. But even as the property became calm again, something inside him didn't settle. Because he knew the surface wasn't the full picture. Beneath the quiet, something was moving. He could feel it in the way the HOA board members avoided eye contact when he drove past their office. He could feel it in the emails that took longer than usual to get answered. He could feel it in the way people in the nearby neighborhood looked at him when he stopped by the grocery store, as if they had heard only one part of the story, and that part didn't come from him. Still, he didn't let any of it push him into anger or worry. He understood that when people made big mistakes, they often spent more time trying to shift blame than accepting it. And he also knew that sooner or later, the truth always came out. On the fourth morning after the meeting, he received a letter from the HOA. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't even a direct explanation. It was more of a politely worded request for a meeting to discuss property adjustments, future planning, and mutual resolutions beneficial to both parties. He read the letter twice. It didn't surprise him that they wanted to meet again, but the tones sounded like they weren't inviting him to talk. They were inviting him because they wanted something from him. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he drove back out to his land, just to walk around and clear his thoughts. The sky was bright that morning. A cool breeze moved through the trees. The land finally felt calm again. As he walked across the clearing, he looked at the spots where the stakes had once been and tried to imagine the trail and benches the HOA had planned. It wasn't that he didn't like the idea of a trail, not at all. He just didn't like the way they went about it. He sat on a fallen log near the edge of the clearing, thinking things through. If they wanted a meeting, he would go. But he wouldn't go unprepared. And he wouldn't agree to anything that allowed them to quietly brush aside their actions. The next day, he went to the HOA office at the time they had suggested. When he entered the meeting room, the atmosphere felt different from the emergency session they had held earlier. This time, there was tension in the air, but it wasn't the tension of people trying to fix a mistake. It was the tension of people trying to rewrite one. The board president spoke first. "Thank you for coming. We want to address the situation with fairness to you and fairness to the community." He nodded for them to continue. A member on the far side of the table cleared his throat. "The incorrect boundary lines were not entirely our fault. The maps we used were taken from the county's older filings," another member added. "We believe the county's documents led to this misunderstanding." He listened without reacting, allowing them to finish. Then the president went on. Given that we invested time and funds into the project, we want to discuss a few possibilities. Perhaps we can lease a portion of your land, or maybe we can work out a shared use agreement, something that benefits both sides. He leaned back slightly, not in disrespect, but in thought. For a moment, he let the room be quiet. Then he spoke. I didn't come here to argue, and I'm not here to create problems, but I want to make one thing very clear. The mistake wasn't the old map. The board stared at him, waiting. It wasn't the county. It wasn't bad luck. It was the fact that nobody here checked with the owner of the land you were building on. That's the real problem, and it's not a small one. Several members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. He continued, You didn't ask. You didn't knock. You didn't send a letter. You didn't even send someone to walk the boundary. You made decisions about land that didn't belong to you. And even after I told you, you kept pushing forward. The president pressed his lips together, but he didn't interrupt. So no, he said softly. I'm not agreeing to lease anything. I'm not agreeing to share anything. What I want is simple. I want you to stop planning anything that touches my property. I want you to correct your maps. And I want your board to own the responsibility for what happened. The room stayed quiet for a long time. Finally, one of the board members sighed. We understand your frustration, but if we accept full responsibility, it could lead to complications. He raised an eyebrow. Complications for who? For the HOA, the man admitted. He nodded slowly. I see. And that was when he realized the real reason for the letter. The HOA wasn't trying to fix the issue, they were trying to soften it. They wanted him to share the blame, so they wouldn't be held accountable for anything that followed. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. He simply stood up. If you have something to propose for compensation or corrections, put it in writing. I'm not agreeing to anything today. The president stood as well, but not confidently. We just want a fair outcome. A fair outcome, he repeated quietly, is honesty. He walked out of the office without slamming a door or making a scene. He didn't need to. The silence he left behind carried the message clearly enough. For the next week, he heard nothing from the HOA. Not a letter. Not an email. Not a call. And the longer the silence stretched, the more he suspected that they weren't taking responsibility quietly. They were preparing some explanation. Something that would frame themselves in a better light. And he was right. A week later, he received an envelope in the mail. Inside were 6 documents, each printed neatly, each carrying a formal tone. They weren't threats. They weren't accusations. But they were carefully written statements from the HOA, claiming the situation had been mutual confusion, shared misunderstanding, boundary ambiguity based on outdated public records, and several other polite ways of saying they didn't want to be the only ones at fault. But the last document was the one that surprised him. It was an official letter, stating that the HOA would withdraw completely from any future development on the disputed land area and compensate him for the inconvenience caused. Compensation came in 6 forms, 6 separate rewards, as they called them. 1. A full reimbursement for the updated land survey. Point 2. A. Property improvement grant for any repairs he needed due to their intrusion. 3. A waiver of any HOA-related access fees for the next decade. 4. A yearly land maintenance stipend, acknowledging their error. 5. A formal written apology from the board. 6. A guarantee that no project would ever approach his property line again without his written approval. Read through the list twice. 6 rewards. 6. Acknowledgements. 6 signs that they finally understood they couldn't pretend he shared the blame. He didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. But he felt something settle inside him, something that had been tight and uneasy for weeks. It wasn't about the money or the grants or the apology. It was about something much simpler. They finally admitted they were wrong. The next morning, he went out to his land again. The sky was a soft blue. The grass moved gently in the breeze. The clearing was empty, quiet, and peaceful, exactly how it had been before the construction materials arrived. He walked across the open space, breathing in slowly. He didn't bring anyone with him, didn't take pictures, didn't post anything online. This moment wasn't about proving anything to anyone else. It was about understanding how close he had come to losing something important, not because someone wanted to steal it, but because someone assumed they had the right to use it without asking. He stood near the center of the land and looked around. The trees, the soil, the open sky, everything looked the same as it had months ago. But he wasn't the same. Something had changed in him. He had learned that protecting what mattered didn't always mean fighting loudly or angrily. Sometimes it meant standing firmly and refusing to accept the easy answers people tried to hand you.